Okay, so again, chapter 6, verse 4, and this is on page 1024 in the Echad. And I'm going to go pretty much word by word. So the first word is Shema. Here, Shema Yisrael, if you will. Hear, O Israel. Shema is here an imperative, right? It's got force. Listen up, right? Pay attention. Right? It's not just, hey guys, this is what God wants from you. It's much more emphatic than that. Yisrael, of course, is referring to the people of Israel. I'll come back to that because I want to see it in a different context when we talk about prayer. So listen up, pay attention, Israel. And now we get to something which is really kind of problematic. It's hard to know exactly what it means. Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. So Adonai, right, God's name, Eloheinu, our God, Adonai, again, Adonai, and then the word Echad, Echad. So we used to say, and the old translations is, God is one, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Here we have alone. So the word Echad can be translated in a number of ways. When we say God is one, generally speaking, people think that means there's only one God, right? But as we've talked about in the book of Deuteronomy, there seems to be a sense that there are other divine beings subservient to God, allocated by God to the other nations, perhaps as a way of bringing them closer. So the idea that there is only one God could mean, well, yes, there are other deities that are worshipped, and they have some power, but only because God allows it. There is only one true God, great God, exalted God, and this is Adonai, who is our God. Right, so that's one way of reading it. Another way of reading it is here, which is alone. And that goes back to the idea, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai is our God alone. That is to say, there may be other gods, but we can and should only worship Adonai. Adonai is the one who brought us out of Egypt. We owe Adonai, and this is consistent with what the idea that we were seeing in the Ten Commandments, right? That God demands of us a certain exclusivity, that it is a betrayal of God. Other nations are allowed to worship who they worship, but we, having been chosen and delivered by God, we can only worship Adonai. For us, Eloheinu, for us, Adonai is the only God. Now, there's another interpretation also, which I kind of like. Not clear to me that the Torah itself intends it. Hard to say, but the way I like to read this is that God is experienced in a variety of ways, but there is a unity to all of them. Right? We say things about God that, frankly, are contradictory. Right? We say God is just. We mean by that absolutely just. And yet we say God is completely merciful. Well, you can't be completely just and completely merciful, at least in human terms, you can't, right? Because if you are completely just, you cannot allow your feelings, your compassion for someone that you are judging to interfere with that judgment. On the other hand, if you're completely merciful, then people are not getting what they deserve, right? So in a sense, I think, at least the way I like to read this, is that these are human terms which are pointing to some aspect of God, but in fact, God is something beyond that. And all of these words that we use about God are really just approximations which reflect more about us and the limits of our language than they really reflect about God, right? But there is a unity to God. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next word, v'ahavta, and you should love. So we are commanded to love God. And as we talked about last time, when we talked about coveting, right? It seems odd to be commanded to have an emotion, right? What does it mean to love God? Well, it seems to me that it is in some ways similar to loving a human being, right? Because love needs to be manifest through action. Otherwise, you can tell someone you love them all day long, and you can feel a certain emotional connection to them. But if your love is not manifested in terms of the way you treat them, is it really love in any meaningful way? So here, I think the idea of loving God is to, yes, desire to be intimate with God. I think there is a part of that. And much of Jewish mysticism is really about how we can experience God more intimately. Right? How do I get closer to the divine reality? So it's partially about that. It's partially about wanting intimacy, wanting to hear God's voice as we read Torah as part of it, right? To have that connection. But it also is doing things for God. Because if you love someone, you do things for them. And so we're going to see here what God wants us to do, and we'll see that in a few minutes. But doing and feeling cannot be disconnected from each other. Now, it says in particular here how we are to love God, and that is with all of our heart, with all our soul, with all our might. So let's take these words individually. The first one, lev, right? We usually translate lev. It's worth noting that in antiquity, the location of the heart was not believed to be in the center of the chest, but up here. That the heart really had to do with thinking more than feeling. So it really, with your whole mind, might actually be a better translation. Now, I want to share with you a rabbinic midrash, which I think is sort of reinforces this idea. So if you look in the Hebrew, and again, we're on page 1025, if you look at the word, we usually say that the word heart is lev, but here, there are two bets, right? Lamed, bet, or vet, right? So why two? So the rabbis say that we should love God not only with our good inclinations, but with our bad inclinations, with the aspects of ourselves. They call it the Yetzer Hara, right? Our desires to do things that aren't right. We should use that. We should harness that in order that we can take even that and use it for the service of God. So good instincts are pretty obvious, generosity, for example, a sense of compassion for other people. But what about using our negative instincts, right, to serve God, right? So I want to give you just a classic example. What if I want people to look at me and admire me and think well of me, and so I give a gift, let's say to the synagogue, or it could be to the symphony or whatever, in order that they will put up a plaque, so that, or maybe even put my name on the whole building. I should only have that ability, right? So people will talk about it, but I as a rabbi, was the rabbi of several synagogues, we think about this, right? What are the naming opportunities, right? And even though we say, well, the best thing about tzedakah is that it should be anonymous, really what we do is encourage people. We say, well, if you give X amount of dollars, your name can be at the top of this list, and then maybe a little lower, and maybe a little lower, right? And people think, well, what will other people think when they see that I gave so much money? So, right? So that's not exactly the highest instinct for a person to have, right? It's not, they simply want to be known that way. But the truth is that in the end, you are serving God in a way, right? Because you're channeling that desire for fame in a way that, in fact, does the kinds of things that God wants you to do in the world, right? So this idea of with your whole heart, not only with the highest of your values, but even with the lower values, which you can somehow transform. You're going to have those feelings. People do. Question is, what do you do with them? Okay, I want to look at the next one, and then we're going to take a break in a minute after I get through these three terms. So your nefesh, right, translated here as soul, right? Nefesh, in a way, we often talk about soul as opposed to body, right? But in biblical Hebrew, the word nefesh really does include the body. The biblical Hebrew doesn't talk about the body versus the soul. So it's really your whole being, right? You have to put, what they say about the hokey pokey? You don't just put your right hand or your left foot, you put your whole self into it, right? And I think bechol nafshecha means with all of you. It means with your intellect, it means with your body, right? Part of doing it with your whole self is, not just thinking good things, not just trying to grow closer, that your soul should be enhanced, right, as you contemplate God, but also that you have to get out in the world to demonstrate your love for God. And finally, ma'odecha, with all your might. The classic translation of might is wherewithal. And that actually can reduce itself down to money. Right? The idea is use your funds in ways that God would approve of. We can't give God gifts, right? If you love somebody, you want to remember their birthday, right? You want to bring flowers, I don't know, whatever you do, right? So how do we use our funds? We're not going to give flowers to God, right? How do we use them, in fact, to demonstrate our love for God? Okay, so again, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So we talked about what it means to say God is Echad, one, unique, alone, however you want to look at it, as well as these three words. I want to stop here. I'm going to change the view. And invite your questions or comments so far in the Shema. Anybody at all before we go on? Sandy, go ahead.
So, Rabbi, as far as giving money to, say, the synagogue, where your name will be on a plaque or whatever, so are you saying that we actually best to do it anonymously?
Yes. So I thought I suggested that. I think the best place to look at this sort of categorized is in Maimonides. And Maimonides talks about levels of giving from the lowest to the highest, right? So the lowest level of giving is to give grudgingly, not only anonymously, not only is it clear that you gave it, but in fact that the recipient knows that you gave it, right? You want to move to a higher level, right? Then it is that they don't know, right? That's why in some ways it's better to give to organizations, which then distribute the money, rather than to give directly, if you have confidence and faith in that organization, right? Because you become, at least with respect to the recipient, right? They don't feel beholden to you. So you're giving willingly, but the recipient, now it's not anonymous, right? Because you're known, right? But we move up the ladder and we get to anonymity, right? As a higher level. And then the highest level, according to Maimonides, if you're thinking perhaps about someone who is impoverished, is to provide them with a job, right? Because ultimately then, don't give someone a fish, teach them how to fish, right? That's the idea, because then they will become more self-sustaining. Right? So yes, anonymity is a good thing, right? And you can say it's better, right? But that's not how people are necessarily wired, right? And the idea here of this rabbinic interpretation of the Shema is, okay, we have certain instincts, right? And maybe, I'm not quite ready to do anonymity. Maybe it's coming actually from the fact, a number of guys I know who make the same kind of money I do. They're on that wall. and I'm kind of, why aren't I there? What are people going to think? A big thing. What are people going to think? That seems very negative. And it's not the best, right? But the recipients do get the money, right? You are doing good in the world, right? So your good instinct might be anonymity, right? But the lesser instinct, right? If you can channel it in positive ways, I think, at least from the rabbinic point of view, that's what the Shema is talking about. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, Myra. Unmute, please.
Okay. I'm interested in when you said something about God and there are lesser gods. I don't get that.
So from the point of view of Deuteronomy, the Bible is interesting in many ways, right? And I'll give you another example, which you'll find even when they talk about, we're forbidden to do certain kinds of magic, but the Bible seems to think that magic is effective. It does work in the world, but we're not supposed to do it. Look at Pharaoh's magicians. They actually do stuff. They duplicate some of the miracles until they reach a certain point, right? So similarly, the Bible does, at least the book of Deuteronomy, and later Jewish tradition, you look at the prophets, they say there are no other gods. Finished. Monotheism means only one God. But here in the book of Deuteronomy, there is this sense that there are lesser beings, authorized by God, created by God, right? They're not gods in that sense. They're not capital G gods, but they are beings that have some power that are beyond human beings, and God allows other nations to worship them. Right? We have a sense, by the way, look at the fact that the Bible seems to reflect this idea of divine messengers, angels come to Abraham, and right, I'm not supposed to worship them, right? But it's not there is a panoply of heavenly beings, but they are all created by God, and they are lower than God, and we shouldn't worship them.
So if you're saying that God permits other nations to worship other beings, you don't mean like the Greeks who worshipped Thor or that's not it, is it?
I think it is.
Oh, okay.
I think it is. One of the things that and to this day I think is interesting about Judaism, we don't try to force people to be Jews, right? There is a sense now. Idolatry is a problem for a variety of ways. We need to stay away from it, right? But there is a sense in which they have their faiths, we have ours. By the way, they happen to be wrong. Right? There is that intrinsic sense of, they're kind of mistaken, or they're worshiping an image of God that isn't quite true to God's nature. But we don't have to go out and convince them that they need to be like us. And in fact, according to the Talmud, they too have a place in the world to come, right? That's okay, as long as they're good people, right? As long as they follow certain basic rules of morality, right? They're not going to hell, right?
I don't want to belabor this, but from what you're saying, that would mean that Jesus could be worshipped.
Yes, I think it does. I think it does, just not by us, because we know better, or however you want to look at it. Yes, I do think so. And I don't think, and by the way, certainly Allah can be worshipped, and in Jewish tradition is actually much more comfortable with the idea of the Muslim God, Muslim image of God, because it lacks any kind of iconography, right? That when Maimonides wrote his Guide to the Perplexed, his great philosophical work, when he talks about God, he uses the word Allah. He was writing in Arabic. It's the word for God. Okay, I don't want to belabor this, but I think Judaism is indeed very tolerant of other faith traditions. Now, the Bible is bothered by it, not because they're not entitled to it, but because they can lead us astray. So when you go into the land, it's going to be very difficult for you, right? And so there is a sense we have to do something about that, not because they're doing something that they shouldn't do, but because they can lead us to do something that we shouldn't do.
Thank you very much.
Sure. And yeah, Hannah.
Yes, you spoke about donations. That brought up for me a very sad effect of donations on my grandfather. He came from Greece with his family around 1907, did well with real estate until the crash. And he was a devoted shul goer, but then he was embarrassed. He couldn't donate anymore. Obviously, it was a very public kind of thing, and it humiliated him to go there and not be able to give. And he just
Yes. So I understand. Right. There can be a downside to it. There's no question about it. And I think there is a sense of embarrassment that comes in a variety of ways when a person loses wealth. And that certainly can be a part of it. I want to say one more thing about Adonai Echad. I'm going to just switch the view for the moment. Oh, that's not switching the view.
And excuse
Here
me,
we
what
are.
page were we on, Rabbi?
Yeah, so we are, give me a second. We are just on page 1025, 1025. So you know that we say at the end of Aleinu, we actually quote a verse from Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, right? Not the bullfrog, the prophet Zechariah, for those of you old enough to know that reference. So we say v'nemar v'haya v'yom hahu, on that day, we say, that messianic moment, God will be one and God's name is one. Right? So, right? Yeah, Adonai Echad u'shmo Echad. So what does that mean? What, right? Isn't God one? Isn't that what we're saying here? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Well, I think the sense in Zechariah is that God's unity is not completely fulfilled until all the people that God created recognize that God is God. The messianic vision that we have in Zechariah, and we see actually in the second paragraph of Aleinu in general, is that we're hoping for the day when the whole world will recognize God as we understand God. And on that day, God will be completely God. It's an interesting idea. It gets picked up in a variety of ways. To give you one example, in Jewish mysticism, there's this very odd, I don't know what to call it. I wouldn't call it a story exactly. It comes to us from the Kabbalah. It's a story about creation, sort of what happens before creation. And it's the story is this. God, in order to create the world, God has to do something called simsum. God has to compact God's self in order to make space where the universe will be. And so God surrounds God's self with what's called a kli, a vessel. But of course, God is too powerful. And so the vessel shatters and sparks of the divine flow throughout the cosmos. Human beings have the job of releasing those sparks and returning them to God in order to unify God. This is a mystical notion, but the idea is, to a certain extent, when we do a mitzvah, we are doing something which actually affects God's unity, bringing those sparks back. You see this idea particularly among Chabadniks, right? So they will go out and they'll, with a van, and they'll stop on a street corner and they'll try to get Jews to put on tefillin. And you might say, yeah, well, maybe they'll do it then, but it's very unlikely that they're going to keep doing it. Why does it matter, really? I mean, it would matter a great deal if they kept doing it. And we'll talk about tefillin soon enough. But I think the sense is that this is tied to this idea of Jewish mysticism, that every mitzvah that a person does affects God in some profound, cosmic way. Right? And I think that idea has its beginnings in this idea, which comes to us from the prophet Zechariah, and we find at the end of Aleinu, right? That we somehow, that all the people in the world recognizing God contributes to God's true unity. And until that time, God is not as fully unified as God will be at that time. Okay, I want to move on now to the next sentence. We're really moving extremely slowly, but I think hopefully it's worthwhile. So we're at verse 6, page 1025. Take to heart these words, right? The Hebrew is V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela asher anochi mitzavcha hayom alevavecha. Take these words on your heart. Put them on your heart. These words which I command you. So the question is, what are the words? Right? You could say it's just the Shema. Literally, these words. Biblically, generally speaking, scholars look at the context here, which is this long speech by Moses. And what's really being referred to here is actually the book of Deuteronomy. That in particular is what we are to take to heart, right? And now what are we going to do with them? And Veshinantem levanecha, you should impress them on your children, teach your children, right? So the obligation here, and this goes back all the way to the Exodus, right? There were three major purposes to the Exodus. One was to get us out of Egypt. The second was to demonstrate God's power and majesty in the world. And the third one was so that we will tell the story, so that we as a people will transmit it, right? So this is essential Jewish. You can say Jews have always valued education, right? Primarily and originally that meant Jewish education, right? In general, though, we tend to be a people, at least up till the last century, I don't know if it's still true, who put a tremendous primacy on education. So teach your children. Now, there's a notion in Judaism that whatever a person can do, they can do through an agent. And it is as though they did that. Hence, Talmud Torah, yeshiva, Hebrew school, all of that, you are essentially delegating to an agent your obligation to teach your child, right? And that's really the sense of it here, to transmit not just the story of the Exodus, but here in Deuteronomy, really to teach them Judaism. Okay? And you should recite them when you are at home in your house, when you're away, and the Hebrew here is Belechtecha baderech, when you are walking in the way, that is not at home, outside, and when you lie down and when you get up. So when you're at home and when you're away, I think has to do, in part at least, with the ideas that we don't say what we do in Vegas stays in Vegas. That there are places in which it's okay to suspend the rules. Right? You've got to be consistent, a Jew in the house and a Jew in the street, right? You can't treat your family according to a certain standard and then go out in the world and treat people to a lower standard, right? Can't just be honest. I want to give you an example. This is very, very many years ago. A kosher butcher was caught selling non-kosher meat. Actually, he was putting blood into chopped meat, right? Probably to make it heavier. And it was caught by the state inspector. And so the word went out and people were not, weren't going to buy from him anymore and so on. And one of the members of my congregation said to him, you got to take this meat back. And he said, I would not do that to you. You're one of my customers. This is for others. They're not the regulars. I did it to them, right? This idea of a double standard, right? What you do in the house, what you do with your core group, and how you treat people outside, right? I think the Shema is talking about that here. What you do at home, what you do outside, it has to be consistent. All these words of the Jewish tradition have to be followed without exception. Okay, I want to share with you the question of here as it's translated, right? Bishwachbaha v'kumecha. When you lie down and when you get up, is a little complicated. I'm going to share my screen with you. We're going to look at a rabbinic debate over what that means. So give me a second. Here we go. Oops, that's not what I want. Let me make this bigger. What am I doing here? Why is this, oh, I see. I get it now. Never mind. Now I understand. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, these were the two great schools of rabbinic thought in the earliest period. Beit Shammai said, you should recite the Shema in the manner indicated in the text of the Shema itself. Therefore, every evening, each person must recline on his side and recite Shema. Right? In other words, when you lie down and when you rise up, you do it when you're lying down, in fulfillment of the verse, when you lie down. In the morning, he must stand and recite Shema in fulfillment of the verse when you rise, as it is stated, when you lie down and when you will rise. Hillel, on the other hand, the other school says, every person recites Shema as he is. He may do so in whatever position is comfortable for him, both day and night, as it is stated when you walk along the way, right? So when you walk along the way, right, one is neither standing nor reclining. So here too, if so, Beit Hillel says, why was it stated when you lie down and when you rise up? This is merely to denote time. At the time when people lie down and at the time when people rise, right? With regard to this, Rabbi Tarfon says, once I was coming on the road, I stopped to recite Shema in accordance with the statement of Shammai. Anyway, he gets attacked by bandits, and it becomes evident that actually following the wrong path, and he should be following the path of Hillel, right? So the words themselves, let me stop sharing the screen. The words themselves are somewhat ambiguous. If I say, though, that it is the time when people lie down and the time when people rise up, then I have to ask, well, what time is that? Right? Is it idiosyncratic? Is it each person, whenever they get up, right? Each person, whenever they lie down? Well, at least lying down, there's kind of a problem with that because we don't know when we're going to fall asleep and so on. So the rabbis go on, and this is the very beginning of the Talmud now. It's the first Mishnah, the earliest section, and it says, from what time do you recite Shema in the morning? And then it'll ask from what time in the evening, and from the time you recite Shema in the morning, from the time that it's light enough that you can distinguish colors. And actually, according to one authority, that's the first 3 hours of, the first 4 hours of daylight. If you divide all the hours of daylight into 12 parts, the first 4 hours of them. The evening is supposed to be said also within a certain context, although there is an opinion that you can say it throughout the night, right? But you can't start earlier than a particular time. The sun has to be going down before you fulfill that obligation, right? So it's all about time, right? And it's specific. There's this great question which is asked, what about kings? When do they say Shema? And you might ask, why is a king different than anyone else? They get to sleep late. That's the answer. The assumption is people can't sleep late. Kings can sleep late, right? And so there's a discussion of what it is for them, right? So here, despite the fact that these words are so familiar, you start to delve into them word by word, and in fact, they become far more opaque. All right, let me give you an opportunity again if there are questions on this, right? On what it means to love God with your heart, your might, your soul, and then teach your children. And when you're in home, when you're away, when you lie down, when you rise up, anything at all. Yeah, Francesca.
One thing from a paragraph ago, they talk about that you should treat others as well as you treat your family. But, I'm a psychologist and I've done a lot of work with domestic violence over the years. And I know many situations where people are model citizens in the world and they're monsters at home.
Yes, and that's precisely what you're being told you can't do, right?
Right.
You have to
both.
have
It goes in both directions.
right.
They didn't.
Right. You're right. When I talked about this, you're quite right to point it out. When I talked about this, I was assuming that you will have a higher ethical standard at home than you do in the world. But in fact, there are cases where people treat their families badly and are out doing good things in the world, right? So yes, I think that is certainly true. Other comments on this? All right, so we're going to go. Yeah, Saul. Unmute, please.
Yeah, I was going to mention that in the Orthodox synagogues, especially in the winter, on Shabbat morning, sometimes they will say the Shema a little earlier so that they don't conflict with the last time they're allowed to say it.
Yes, although it generally speaking, it can be the opposite way, right? If you're going to say your prayers, let's say the minyan meets every day at 7, right? So the question, how dark, or if you're really up early, 6:30, how dark is it? Maybe it's too early, right? And so the idea is to come back again later, and you haven't really fulfilled the mitzvah of saying Shema in its proper time. The idea is to come back later, do it again. It's similar, right? That you have to be attuned to the clock, and there's no reason why you can't say Shema multiple times during the day. Right? You're only required to do it in the morning and the evening, but you can do it at other times. And we're going to talk. I'm going to talk. It looks like it's going to be next time, given the hour. I want to talk actually a great deal about how Shema is used in the liturgy and in the prayer book, which is really separate from what we're looking at here, right? It flows from it, but it takes it has an important place in the service. I'm going to go back now, unless there's something else. All right, so I'm going to at least introduce the end. There is so much here to unpack, but here I'm going to just change the view. Okay, so Thou gets this idea that you should, all right, kshartem liot al yadecha, you should make them a sign on your hand, v'hayu letotafot beinenecha, and they should be for a symbol. They used to say frontlets. I don't know if you know any of the old translations. They put them as frontlets between your eyes and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So this is what we're generally speaking of as tefillin and mezuzah, right? Now, it's not obvious, at least with respect to the idea of a sign on your arm and this symbol between your eyes. It's not obvious that that means literally bind them, physically put them on. And in fact, there were the Samaritans, for example, who have the same Torah that we did. There's still some of them around in Israel, actually. It's very, we talk about the Good Samaritan in the New Testament. Samaritans are just a religious group. At any rate, And they, by the way, don't have a Chumash, right? 5 books. They have a 6-book Bible. They include the book of Joshua also into what they would say is the Torah. At any rate, they say, no, this is a metaphor. It's not like you literally put them on your arm between your eyes. And it's not just them. Later on, you get the Karaites, they say the same thing, right? And it makes a certain amount of sense for 2 reasons. One is that you could, well, for example, we have other places where it says, put me as a seal on your heart. Right? Simani kechotem al libecha, right? Are we literally saying that you should wear a seal on your heart with these words? Probably, at least we don't understand it that way. So what does it mean that it should be on your arm? Perhaps it just means that your actions, your way of being in the world should be guided by these words. And between your eyes, that the way you see the world should be through the lens of Torah. Certainly a possibility. It is not what the Jewish tradition has decided that it means, which is to literally take these words and bind them on your arm and between your eyes. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more next time, and we'll talk about mezuzah extensively next time. I do want to just talk about the word here for a moment. It says symbol. Symbol is an oat, right? An oat is a sign, and traditionally a sign of the covenant, right? So we have, God puts the rainbow in the sky as a sign of the covenant that God makes between God and, the living creatures of the world, that God will not flood the world again. God makes a covenant with Abraham, and the sign is circumcision, right? God makes a covenant with the Jewish people at Sinai, right? And the sign perhaps is the Torah itself. So here, the idea of a sign, right, is the reason why, according to rabbinic tradition, we don't wear tefillin on Shabbat, right? Because the rabbis say, we say about Shabbat, oti liolam, it is a sign forever. So the rabbis say, we don't need 2 signs. We have the sign, which is Shabbat itself, but during an ordinary weekday, well, you don't have that, so you need this sign. So on Shabbat and holidays, you don't wear tefillin, but ordinary days you do. And there's actually a debate about what about the intermediate days, like Passover, not the first 2 days or the last 2 days, but the days in the middle. Are they more like weekdays, or are they more like Shabbos and holidays? So should you wear them? Should you not? And actually, the Ashkenazic and Sephardic traditions are different there. Ashkenazic Jews traditionally wear them all through the holiday during those intermediate days, and Sephardic Jews do not. And I'll end with just a story about this, because when I started rabbinical school, I was not an observant Jew. I went there just to study. I didn't know much. I really wasn't used to putting on tefillin all the time until I went to rabbinical school. So I went to the synagogue during Sukkot, because it was the beginning of the year. I had started there, and I didn't know whether you're supposed to wear tefillin or not. So there was this older guy who was going in. I didn't know who he was at the time, and I said, "Tefillin?" ? And he said, "Do what your father did." Right? Because meaning, if you're Ashkenazic, you'll do that. Well, my father never put on tefillin that I know of. He was not an observant Jew at all. So I took him quite literally, and I said, "Okay, I don't wear them." Right? Well, it turned out that the person I asked was probably the greatest expert in Jewish law in the world at that day. A man named Saul Lieberman, Rabbi Saul Lieberman. And so ever since then, I don't wear tefillin on the intermediate days of holidays. And I always say, Rabbi Saul Lieberman gave me this rabbinic decision not to wear them. Anyway, I don't wear them because I think there are enough other signs, and I like what the Spartan thing. On Sukkot, you have a sign. You have the lulav. You're waving it every day. You go into the sukkah, and on Pesach, of course, we have matzah and all kinds of other things to remind us. Okay, let me change the view to the speaker view. Yes, wait, no. Yeah, I meant the gallery view. That's my problem. A little famish this morning. Okay. Any final questions before we wrap up? We will talk about Tefillin and mezuzot a little bit more, especially mezuzot next week. And then we're going to get into how we use these words of the Shema and some others to in terms of prayer. Anything at all? All right, I do want to mention something I completely forgot to mention. So I'm glad I had the opportunity to do this. If you go back to page 1024, to the very beginning of the Shema. If you look at that first sentence, right? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. If you look at the word Shema, you look at the last letter of the word Shema, you'll see something, which is that the ayin is big. It's bigger than, and if you look at a Torah scroll, you'll see it the same way. And if you look at the last letter of Echad, the last letter, the Dalet, is also big. And that's how it's printed. So ayin Dalet means aid. You take those two letters and make them into a word, aid is a witness. So the idea is that when we, and I'll talk about this when we talk about prayer, part of what we are doing by reciting Shema is serving as a witness to God's kingship, to God's glory. The rabbis say that this is Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shemayim, that we are accepting on ourselves the kingship of heaven. So I did want to mention that because I completely forgot to mention it. And on that note, this is the last time I'll mention it, but because I don't want to be twisting people's arms. Thank you. I think virtually all of you actually sent some money in for the class. I appreciate your sponsorship. And that's it on that. So I will hope to see you next week, where we will pursue Tefillin, mezuzah, and the Shema itself as it appears in our prayer book. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.